Hello, everyone. I thank you for joining us for our PFAS, an Environmental Attorney's Perspective webinar. We will begin in just a moment. I wanted to go ahead and go over a few administrative items. On the top right-hand side of your screen, you should see a view button where you can view as a gallery so that you can view the speakers along with the presentation as we go along. We will also be taking questions in the Q&A section, so please feel free to ask your questions there. And Gorm, without further ado, go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Sarah. It's almost time, is it? Or is my clock a little bit behind? But we can begin. Absolutely. Welcome, everyone, to this webinar series. And today we have Jeff Longsworth here from Barnes and Thornburg. And that's very exciting for us because normally we're mostly talking to engineers and geologists and technical people about how do you heat this up and what do you do with the vapors and all that. But the perspective Jeff has is very different. It's about essentially sometimes these things go to court and you got to follow the rules, and the rules are changing constantly. So I would like to open it up by asking you, Jeff, essentially, what is your background, and how can you how come you know so much about the PFAS issue?
Well, thanks, Gorm. So, and I would like to thank you and TRS Group for having me. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here today. I'm essentially, I guess, now 30 years in the environmental legal world. Most of that is related to different issues under Clean Water Act mainly. And as your practice matures, you develop expertise in certain areas as well as different focus areas, whether it's different regulatory matters or in fact different industries. And I do a lot of work in the airport and aviation industry. So we've been following PFAS for a number of years because it's a required ingredient in the AFFF that the federal government forces commercial airports to use. We'll talk more about that later. But so we've known that this issue was going to be coming for some time and have tried to follow the developments domestically and internationally. And as it has evolved, I represent a number of airports that have been subject to mandatory investigations and now embroiled in determinations of potential liabilities, as well as other industries. So that's really kind of started in the aviation world, but as the issues have grown, we have expanded and grown our traction on PFAS issues with that. I now am the, as it says, co-chair of our emerging contaminants practice group. I also, along with a couple of other partners, we started a PFAS regulatory coalition. We'll talk a little bit more about that at some point. And it's followed through on a whole variety of legal issues. And now we're really kind of immersed in the whole kind of panoply of issues that are facing all sorts of industries, from regulatory developments, whether it's federal, state, international, on to kind of site remediation, investigations. As I mentioned, we're working with different entities around the country on various investigations. We're following all of the regulatory developments at the federal government. It's the next slide if you want. Federal government, as well as state governments, and how they're trying to develop new regulations. We comment on all of those different activities. A lot of issues related to municipalities, in addition to airports, from POTWs and land application of biosolids, to various transactions of properties that may have been contaminated with PFAS at one point. A lot of issues just related to construction and modifications of existing properties. Again, if you move that dirt around and it's been contaminated with PFAS and you're unaware, you may be spreading that contamination all over your site. So there are a lot of kind of ongoing kind of counseling issues that we're helping clients with. We look a lot at recovery, insurance recovery issues, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about some of these insurance issues because they're very interesting and can be very important considerations for anybody facing PFAS related liabilities. And certainly all of the, and there are hundreds of cases related just to the AFFF, or the aqueous film forming foam that's used in firefighting. And all of those cases have been consolidated down into the federal district court for South Carolina. And again, that's a multi-district litigation that will go on for years. This is obviously an issue that grows daily, monthly, yearly. Some have predicted, and I've thought since the beginning, perhaps eventually we're moving towards some kind of tobacco trust fund settlement type model or something else. But we know that there's a significant amount of liability out there for a whole host of entities and a number of cases.
You mentioned the regulatory coalition. What is that, and who started it?
Sure. So at our firm, we tend to kind of look towards groups of clients and how they can monitor and follow things. So we've actually developed a number of coalitions in our past. And especially when you're getting into a new issue like PFAS, there are a lot of entities that may not directly be impacted, may think they might be impacted in the future, and they may not just want to retain the firm individually to follow these things. So we found that developing coalitions provides us kind of great economies of scale to engage in a lot of the ongoing activities that a lot of our clients would want to do, but can't afford to do that individually, or it just doesn't make cost sense for them. So we developed a coalition a year ago in January of 2020. We have in it a bunch of industrial users, and other interested parties that are engaged and affected by PFAS. These include trade associations, companies, municipal entities, whether, for example, publicly owned treatment works or drinking water supply agencies, airports, I already mentioned, a whole variety of potential municipal interests, as well as consultants, our members. And our only real limitation is we decided early on not to include the PFAS manufacturers within this coalition. We have a lot of issues in common with them. We share information and we work with them and with their trade associations and other groups, but at some point we think there may be a split in the road between those being impacted and those manufacturing. And so we made that conscious decision early on to stick with the entities that are being impacted but not manufacture PFAS. And the coalition itself is really focused on all of the federal and state regulatory activities. We follow some legislative activities and we provide some comments on some new legislation, but we're not really a lobbying organization per se. There are other entities, especially in Washington, D.C., that are lobbying on behalf of PFAS interests. So we're really looking at regulatory issues. We've commented now on more than a dozen, probably approaching 20 different state laws and regulations over the past year. Most recently last week in New Jersey, and the week before that, and the Washington State PFAS Action Plan. So we have a whole variety of activities going on, probably more so sometimes than we think we can handle, but we have a great membership and people bring not only issues and questions to the table, but also resources and assistance. So it's a very collaborative group that's working together.
Yeah, I think even us trying to come up with solutions for treating PFAS in water and PFAS in soil, we have this issue that even in each state we have to look up what are the rules here. If we can treat this soil, how clean does it have to be? And sometimes there isn't even a standard yet, right? So wow, it's got to be a lot of stuff to keep track of, the rules and the regulations. So if you're an airport and airports have firefighting vehicles, right? They have to have these super fast trucks that are ready to go out if there's an airplane on fire, or and they have the AFFF foam that they spray, and all their vehicles have that in their tanks and so on. It sounds like that's being phased out and they're being forced to stop using the fluorinated compounds and using another non-fluorinated type of foam to put out fires. How must be amazingly difficult now in these days with COVID-19 and the less flying, less income. Isn't that must be almost be the worst type of timing that these airports have to come up with funding to replace their AFFF phones with something else, and they have almost no income. How's that going to work out? Do you think? Is there going to be some way that they're going to get some help? And do you think they'll be able to afford changing out their vehicles?
Yeah, so airports definitely have a unique position in this because they've been forced by the federal government to use foam that meets the military specification, and that foam has to have PFAS in it in order to perform as required by the military specification. Now, recognize the military specification really is also designed to protect, submarines and aircraft carriers and other things. Not that airports don't have important cargo as passengers and everything else, but there is a little bit of a disconnect there, and yet the FAA has required that. I would say that all of the airports have switched from the long chain, which was the C8, which has the PFOS, PFOA in it, to the newer formulations, the shorter chains that have been around for 5 and more years. So I think that conversion has already occurred. And then the question is, how do you move towards PFAS free? Now, some entities will sell firefighting foam as PFOS free, but we know that just means that it doesn't have the C8, it has C6, and it's not necessarily PFAS free. And Congress got involved in this whole process in the National Defense Authorization Act a couple years ago, and they've mandated that FAA approve a fluorine-free foam by this coming October. Now, obviously, that went into law before the whole pandemic, and FAA built a research center in Atlantic City, New Jersey. They have been working actively, but they've been impacted themselves by COVID in terms of their research. So there are questions about whether they'll achieve an approved fluorine-free foam by October 2021, but that just kind of sets in the whole motion of converting over from fluorinated foam to fluorine-free foam. Interestingly, in more recent legislation, the DoD was provided. Actually, the FAA mandate was in the FAA reauthorization. The National Defense Authorization is what requires DoD to switch over by October 2024. So you can see different dates there, and it'll be interesting to see, since each dates were set by different pieces of legislation, whether any amendments will go in to merge those dates or not. But we know that eventually there will be a fluorine-free foam that will be approved for airports, and they're going to have to take all of their, very expensive equipment, like in the picture here, and convert that over. So there are processes and research in place, and I know that you all are involved in some of the research on how to effectively rinse and clean these trucks, and then treat that rinsate in order to be able to prepare them for using non-fluorinated foams in order to continue to kind of protect the environment in that regard. And FDA is working on new standards in this area. So it's a lot going on, and you're right. It's a lot going on at a point when air travel is down to less than 10% of what it was a year ago in some places. And airports have been hard hit by revenue issues and COVID at a time now when they're going to be expected to make major investments, not only in converting over, but potentially in terms of doing investigations and cleanup. So that's just one example. There are other industries that are going through similar things. that have relied on AFFF with that's been fluorinated. And as they switch over, there will be some interesting decisions that industries will have to make in terms of this kind of conversion process.
Mhm. Yeah. What is there a reason why we don't just say right now it's no longer allowed to use AFFF? Can you tell us a little bit about that? And I think it has to do with how effective it is at extinguishing fires, right? But don't we have any other ways of doing it that is just as safe at the moment?
Sure, and I'll start by saying, obviously, I'm not a scientist or an engineer, but I have heard that number one, the length of time that it takes for the fluorine-free foams to put out, petroleum-based fires is longer than existing foams. I know that they have been improving in that regard, and again, the FAA is doing the research up in Atlantic City to make sure that they work adequately. And then the other problem has been, one of the great benefits of the existing foams is that once they put that fire out, you still have all of that hot fuel underneath this blanket of foam, and that blanket is maintained and keeps that from reigniting. So it provides that opportunity to get passengers out of an airplane safely once the initial fire may be put out, whether it was just an engine fire or something else, as opposed to turning it into a major disaster. They can get the fire out and they can keep the fire out. And I think that subsequent ability to keep that layer, that blanket on top of the foam, is another area where research is ongoing. So, again, we'll have challenges as we try to convert over. As soon as FAA approves a foam or several foams, we're still going to have all of those market issues of supply and demand. How quickly can it be distributed? You have, over I think 400 commercial airports in the country, and plus there are a lot of international demand. Not that they go by the U.S. mil spec, but once the U.S. approves foams, that may influence a lot of other countries. And fluorinated foams are being used effectively at airports internationally, particularly Europe and some other places. But once it's approved in the U.S., there will be an entire conversion process. And then you have the issues of, what do you do with the old foam? Is there going to be some kind of take-back program, either by the federal government? Some states already have some take-back programs. Michigan, for example, went through and collected it not only from airports, but from firehouses, and then disposed of all of the foam, the C8 foam that was existing in the state of Michigan. And I know other states are looking at that too. So you have that. You have mutual aid agreements. Airports have mutual aid agreements with their local counties. Industries have mutual aid agreements where, you may have a series of refineries or chemical plants near each other that have mutual aid agreements in place. So if one moves towards fluorine-free foam and the others don't, how does that impact your mutual aid agreements in place? And then who's responsible for saying, yes, foam has to be used or not? Is it a precautionary thing? So there are a lot of legal issues just baked into that whole process of preventing disasters. And that kind of comes to some of the the risk analyses you have to take. Is there a benefit to having a fluorinated foam that might prevent a disaster, but then create an entirely new cleanup scenario versus a currently what might be a less effective foam and less reassurance that you're going to avoid that kind of disaster? So there are a lot of issues at play, certainly. And then as states and the federal government start working on new and different mandates, and we've seen some that basically prohibit the use of foam, and obviously they have to be amended to allow for foam that's mandated by the federal government, for example, like at airports, but they go to prohibit foam and having appropriate exclusions and exemptions and recognitions that there really is a risk trade-off right now based on the performance of the different foams out there on the marketplace. So these are all interesting considerations.
Yeah. Wow. So a whole different type of situation. There's a lot of we TRS works at a lot of commercial sites, brownfield sites, for instance, where people have found something on their property. Now they have to clean it up, and they need to do it to a certain standard. A lot of these sites we've actually cleaned up, right? And then we think, okay, now everything is fine. Now if it's a brownfield site, now you can build on it. When a lot of these projects were done, we didn't even know about PFAS, and we certainly didn't sample for it in the soil. When you heat a site for a long time, you make sure there's no more TCE or very low concentrations of it. It meets all the regulatory limits for that, but we never really looked for PFAS. So how is it if you have a site and you find PFAS now, either in the water or in the soil, would your insurance that you typically have on a property, would that cover that, or are you just in trouble if you find it?
Well, and again, I'm not an insurance lawyer, but I do know something in this area just because of the whole PFAS area, and we can provide some more information that you can share that's more comprehensive. But insurance is really regulated on a state-by-state basis. So it really depends a little bit on the language of the specific policy, any related exclusions within that policy, as well as when you got that policy and what jurisdiction you're in. All of those come into play because different jurisdictions interpret pollution exclusions quite differently under particular circumstances. For example, some jurisdictions interpret policies to exclude coverage only for traditional environmental pollutants or contamination, but others may impose other claims, claims related to indoor spills versus discharges or outdoor contamination. And again, this whole notion of pollution exclusions really started in the 1970s, became pretty widespread for the insurance companies in the 1980s. But as you indicated, a lot of this pollution is legacy kind of PFAS pollution. So it's possible that the polluting event occurred before the pollution exclusion was added to a policy. So you may be covered by that your comprehensive liability policy from the 70s and 80s. So there's some of this kind of insurance forensic issues, finding old policies, finding out what these old policies said, there are ways of doing that, and then taking a look at whether your state regulations allow you to go back after those insurance companies to help contribute towards your cleanup for your liabilities. Because again, a lot of times people had no idea, and still until this day, some have no idea whether they have PFAS contamination or not. We know that when you look for it, and we're measuring in parts per trillion, when you look for it, you're going to find it, and you need to know what you're going to do in your next step after you find it. But one of the first things you'll need to do if you think you have problems is start identifying those potential insurance policies and insurance companies, and putting those companies on notice that you think you may have a claim against them for coverage, assuming that the coverage works. So again, I can provide you, some more information on that you can share with the listeners. It tends to get pretty complicated pretty quickly, but we have some pretty simple fact sheets that might help people out.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's tough to think about how we always felt we were good when we had our fire extinguishers, and we made sure they were already always there. And when we had health and safety training, we used them and showed how to do it, how to put out a fire, spraying from the bottom or from the side. And all of a sudden now that's created all stuff.
I hear you. At the same time, we can't lose sight of the fact that while PFAS is something that now needs to be investigated and cleaned up, because there are potential human health impacts to humans, whether through drinking water or firefighters from using it, the bottom line is it served a very valuable purpose, and it has saved many, many lives also. Now we just have to come to grips with what we know now versus what we knew before, and trying to figure out what the right standards are and how to clean things up.
Yeah, very good. I just want to remind those listening that there's a Q&A button in that drop-down menu, and you're more than welcome to type in a question. In about 5 minutes or 10 minutes, we'll be done with the kind of the beginning content, and I'll read some questions that come in for Jeff. So please don't hold back on that. It's a little Q&A field at the top of your screen that should drop down. I have a few more questions. The EPA is, of course, very aware of this issue, and I've seen a lot of fantastic work that they're doing, including their PFAS Action Plan. Can you tell us a little bit about the status of what the EPA is doing and where they're at with respect to PFAS?
Sure. So actually, they came out with their original PFAS action plan as a result of a variety of other activities they had done in February of 2019. And what people don't necessarily realize is they realize that EPA is a big federal agency. What they don't realize on PFAS is this is the first time that EPA has ever put together a comprehensive plan with input from every one of its offices in every one of its disciplines. So it's unique in that regard. It's pretty easy to find. You can just Google EPA PFAS Action Plan and it'll bring you right to the webpage. And they've made a variety of developments. In the last couple of months, they've actually had a number of new actions that people may be interested in. For one, there's now a Federal Register notice, which has not appeared yet in the Federal Register. It's being held up as part of every new administration signs an executive order that basically holds everything up in the Federal Register for review before it gets published. But that would designate PFOA and PFOS as constituents needed for drinking water maximum contaminant levels. So EPA has at least indicated and looks like it will move forward with development of what we call MCLs for drinking water for PFOS, PFOA within the next 2 years to finalize that. They've also put out an interim policy on monitoring for PFAS and NPDES permits. Now, all your technical people know that EPA only has one, or actually two, approved analytical methods for PFAS, and both are related to testing drinking water. So when you start looking at wastewater or stormwater or other things, typically labs have to modify that method. Different labs modify it differently. We've seen a whole variety of different types of results out there. But EPA is working on an analytical method that they expect to have done in 2021 that can be used for groundwater, wastewater, stormwater, and they put out this strategy to encourage PFAS monitoring for sites where PFAS may be a known or perceived pollutant associated with the facility's operations. And those sites will have to start monitoring for PFAS at some point in the not too distant future. EPA was required by that National Defense Authorization Act to put out guidance on disposing and destroying the PFAS in different media. And they worked hard. The deadline for that was December of 2020, and they worked hard and they put out what they call their guidance. I would call it less guidance and more kind of status of research on different types of disposal and destruction methodologies that can come into play. Recognizing that EPA is challenged in how it does regulations, both in terms of process set out by statute, but also before anything that EPA publishes, it goes through the Office of Management and Budget, and all of their federal brethren, whether it's DoD or any other agency, has a crack at looking at this and tends to make it a pretty bureaucratic and tough process. And sometimes you end up with kind of that lowest common denominator approach of information that every agency feels comfortable with. So EPA is in a tough situation there, but that guidance is really not as robust as we would like. And we're hoping that as more research goes on, then we'll be able to we'll get revised guidance out. They also have drafted what they call an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking. So it's not really a proposal, but really it's just requesting information on how and whether EPA should designate PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances under CERCLA. And that's a huge issue because if they become subject to the hazardous substance designation under CERCLA, that changes the whole nature and focus of remediation, of historic contamination, joint and several liability. You no longer need to find all of the people that might be responsible for contaminating the site. As soon as you find one, this concept of joint and several liability means that one entity can have all of the obligations, even though they may have been a small percent contributor to that larger site. So that's a really important issue. Again, not in the Federal Register yet, and some believe that the Biden administration may convert that from an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking to an actual proposal. We'll have to wait and see. And then EPA has also proposed to add 29 PFAS compounds to what they call their UCMR, which is really their unregulated contaminant monitoring list for drinking water entities. The largest drinking water providers across the country will have to add additional monitoring. PFOS, PFOA, and a couple other PFAS compounds were included in the UCMR4. That data is out there on the internet from across the country. That's where they collected a lot of information on contaminated drinking water sources. But the new UCMR now includes 29 different PFAS contaminants, and they'll be getting that information in also. So a lot going on in the federal government perspective.
Yeah. So one thing as a European, one thing that always surprised me after I came to the US was, when we were treating, let's say, PCE and TCE, I was always thinking, okay, there must be some level in the water and in the soil that's safe, and you treat to that level. But then I realized it depended on what state you're in. If you're in California, it had to be super clean. But if you're in Illinois, it could be like 1,000 times higher, and you're done. It's okay. Are we going to go through this same type of thing with the different states having their own standards for how clean the water must be, and if you treat soil, to what level do you have to go? Or have we by now learned enough that the EPA just goes in and says, all right, no matter what state you're in, this is PFAS, this is a toxic compound, let's set some thresholds in soil and water, and instead of each state having to come up with their own.
Sure. So there are a lot of issues there. It's a lot to unpack, but as I indicated, the federal government's moving about as fast as the federal government can move to set standards. And right now, they have a long-term health advisory of 70 combined for PFOS, PFOA, and they have some other, advisory guidance standards. States are impatient. You look at a state like Michigan that went through the whole Flint water crisis. Michigan has been extremely active in PFAS, and they feel like they can't wait for the federal government. Other states have jumped on the bandwagon either for political purposes or whatever, and we kind of joke a little bit, but not really a joke, that the states are in this race to zero. Who can get down to the single digits the fastest for standards? And if you talk to different states, you get different perspectives on that. They all different, different studies to base their standards on and add additional levels of conservative, assumptions into that. So it's pretty crazy. I think it's pretty clear that our analytical capabilities have exceeded our understanding of the toxicological issues related to the different PFAS compounds, and that's part of what the coalition is about, is trying to get uniform state standards, get them to look at the right types of studies and information, and have a little bit uniformity. The last thing we want is the 50-state solution. I mean, you say you're from Europe, that's part of the reason you have the EU, is to develop standards so that you don't have every country having to do it on their own. We're a little different, but we in a federalist society, but we're working at it, and hopefully before long we can all get on the same page. And I've seen some movement in that direction, but I think that initially under the Trump administration in particular, certain states felt like they had to move on their own, just whether politically or for whatever reason. So bottom line is, there are different tools for the states to use. They're using them, and we're trying to follow them and keep them focused on the individual compounds, not regulating as entire classes of chemicals, and making sure that they're using appropriate information. But I think we got a bunch of questions and answers, Gorm, so I'm happy to turn to those.
Yep.
Yours are getting harder and harder. Maybe some other ones. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's time. There's a there's a couple of I'll read a couple of the easier ones. I hope. One of them is, do you see state and federal agencies reopening sites that have been previously closed, for instance, dry cleaners, because due to suspected PFAS impacts?
Absolutely. So it's even CERCLA sites that were closed based on cleanup of the pollutants of concern at issue at the time of the CERCLA action, and then officially closed, are now being reopened because of PFAS. We're going to see that a lot with landfills and other disposal areas where they thought they were clean for whatever the pollutant of concern may have been in the past, but they're finding out that there's a lot of PFAS. This is going to be an issue that is going to be prevalent across the country, anywhere where there are former military bases, former even airports, landfills, the areas where we know that PFAS was involved, metal finishing, carpet manufacturing, or that type of stain resistant manufacturing, along with waste. One of the largest sites in Michigan is the Wolverine site, where they were waterproofing leather for boots, and all of the waste associated with that, and the significant PFAS contamination. So we're going to see that across the country.
Yeah. I feel like the one from Eric talking about occupational exposure is very interesting. His question has to do with basically around public health. Workers who have worked with the foams and application and cleanup after fires and all that. He says it seems like there should be some occupational exposure limits. Do you know?
It's a great point, and I know that I might be wrong, but I believe it's the University of Arizona is doing a voluntary study with firefighters from across the country, where firefighters are providing blood samples, and they're doing analysis of what their exposures have been. Obviously, it's a critical issue. Our firefighters serve such a valuable place in our communities and at airports and at DoD bases and elsewhere where foam has been used, and we need to understand better what risks there may be there. And I think that research is ongoing, and whether that will lead to occupational standards or not, that may depend on how quickly we are getting rid of the various PFAS compounds that are causing those issues. So, hopefully we get rid of them, and we have substitutes for them that can be demonstrated to be safer. Sometimes, the substitution issue, you never really know what you're getting in a substitution. But hopefully we can identify that before maybe standards are needed. But we definitely need to care about those that have been exposed through work and through mandatory requirements that have been placed on them.
It's hard to know also who have been exposed, right? It's not like you get a red nose or some very clear symptom from PFAS exposure, right? These are very chronic, long-term things, cancers and things you probably don't necessarily see quickly.
And the route of exposure, it's all about kind of pathways. Maybe you may have terrible contamination on a site, but based on the site's geology, it may all be contained, or it may not be. I mean, there have been instances in Maine and New Mexico, I believe, where there's contamination from military bases that got into groundwater. Groundwater was used to irrigate pastures that cows grazed on, and they found PFAS in the milk and the meat in those, and have had to slaughter those cows. But if you think about that option, or as I mentioned earlier, where there's been beneficial reuse of sewage sludge from PO2Ws that met all of the current standards, but they didn't look at PFAS, we don't know. These are a lot of unknowns as to where that was used, whether it's causing an impact or not, we don't know. There's a lot of presumption out there, but again, the facts are what we're after and are hard to get.
Yeah. There's a good one from John about the low concentration limits expected for soil. In other words, you have to clean soils to very low concentrations, probably, coupled with airports, runways having to stay open and all that. Do you see that the airport industry will look for technical impracticability waivers, like in the old days people did for DNAPL, for instance?
Well, I think airports are a little bit in a unique circumstance because, again, they were forced to use it. What do you do once you find it? I know you guys have a lot of technologies about how to manage soil that's been contaminated. We talked about the fact that, airports are pretty standard. They're going to have ongoing construction activities. Where has that soil been moved at the airport? How extensive is the contamination or not? These are important questions. We're measuring down to parts per trillion. States like Massachusetts are looking at standards for 6 PFAS and a total PFAS of 20 is their standard. So at 6, you could be 4 parts per trillion for all 6 of those PFAS compounds, and you're now in excess of their standard. And yet, I don't think there's the toxicology data that shows that 4 parts is necessarily the bright line for safety or not. But we're dealing with all of these issues, and I think part of the concern over EPA's enforcement guidance is it doesn't give us answers for what we do. So we look to companies like TRS Group and others for taking massive soil contaminated areas. And I know you have a heat process that you've talked about. I know that you have the perfluoride for contaminated waters. That these are the kinds of things that we're, as lawyers, we're looking to you guys to help us, educate us on how we can manage these different sites. But yeah, there are challenges. There are challenges in terms of what you're going to do and how soon you can do it. But again, I get back to the fact that it's really about pathways. If you have a pathway that has contamination that's resulting in contaminated drinking water wells, then action needs to be taken sooner than later. If it's something that's very manageable on site and we can manage it safely on site without a pathway until there's a technology that comes along that's cost efficient and effective, then maybe that's the best thing to do. I think, we're still learning. I learn new things every day. I learn new things from you and from TRS all the time. So, so these are all good questions. And I'm sorry, I don't have perfect answers for them, but that's the evolving nature of what we're dealing with.
Yeah. Yeah, we definitely have a thermal solution, right? A high temperature cooking solution for PFAS, if you will. Luckily, Shell and others started back in the 80s studying high temperature thermal desorption, also in situ for dioxins and for PCBs. And it turns out that at the same temperatures with the exact same equipment, you can basically remove PFAS from soil. So that part, luckily, we have like a 20-30 year head start on. Then when it comes to the surface, it's a little different because the PFAS, there are so many different contaminants, and there's partial breakdown of the PFAS parent compounds into smaller ones, the sulfur, sulfonate groups sometimes jump off. So we have more challenges essentially figuring out how to handle the PFAS vapors and in the liquid stream when it comes out. But we're definitely making progress on that for sure. I'll definitely read a few more questions. Earl has a good one here. There's really, have any responsible parties litigated with EPA regarding their authority to require PFAS, PFOA sampling under RCRA and CERCLA, given that they're not currently hazardous substances?
That is a good question. There are a number of really good questions, and I'd like to answer them all. Maybe we can provide some answers later if we do run out of time. But right now, EPA is just at the initial stages of trying to regulate PFOA, PFOS under CERCLA. So there are no mandates or requirements right now from EPA. There are states that are setting their own standards. States are allowed to have their own kind of RCRA equivalent types of programs. So you have some states that already have soil and groundwater standards for PFOS, PFOA, and other PFAS constituents. And a lot of these standards are new, as some of them have been promulgated. There have been industry challenges to them. I know in New Hampshire, there's been some litigation in New Jersey, elsewhere. Most of these standards are new, so the litigation is just starting out, and it'll be interesting to see whether the standards can, be defended as science-based and justified based on the state process for developing standards. But you're right. It's and the question gets to a key issue is it's one thing to tell us to go look for it and to set a standard. It's another thing to then tell us how to resolve it and clean it up once we find it. There are numerous examples of states. Right now, Illinois is requiring all the drinking water sources to sample. If they find it, they're immediately identified on a live map from the Illinois EPA. And talking with the Illinois EPA, they don't really have answers to what those sources are supposed to be doing in order to treat water or provide end-of-use filters or whatever the case may be. It may be a combination of things. So again, we're developing regulations and standards without all of the pieces of the puzzle to make the complete puzzle and how to clean it up and address it.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that, Jeff. For instance, we have two ESTCP projects right now demonstrating PFAS soil treatment. And just a really simple question we have trouble answering is, so what would success look like? We have, for instance, from Eielson Air Force Base, there's 52 soil piles with PFAS in it, and some of them have 3,000 parts per billion starting concentration. So what do we need to treat to is even a question we have to come up with, like an idea ourselves. It's like, yeah, well, we will set a standard of 10, but if we can get down to 1, that's great too. It's really interesting to not have a goal yet, but having to make it up. Even while we've been talking this hour, there's probably been another PFAS molecule identified somewhere, right, that gets added to the list at some point. So it is a little bit of a moving target, but a very interesting field for sure.
And these are important issues because I don't advocate just blindly going out and sampling and testing. Again, my view is if you look for it, you'll find it. Again, parts per trillion. So I think you have to have a really kind of a detailed strategy and plan in place as you move forward. You have to know, if I look here and find it, what does that mean? And what does that lead to as terms of my next step? And am I willing to do that next step? And so having this kind of stepwise, thoughtful approach, there are ways of doing it. There are ways of testing your wastewater now, where you wouldn't have to report that information. If you don't test it, your outfall, or if you don't use EPA analytical methods, which there are no approved ones right now, you could even get a jump start if you think you might eventually have to monitor for PFAS, or if you think that you're causing contamination that could be impacting neighboring properties, including people that might be using drinking water wells, you know, your obligations may be, you know, stepped up just from a moral and community sense. But the bottom line is you need to think through all these different steps before you just run out. I mean, I've gotten calls from POTWs that say, we tested it in our biosolids that we, you know, beneficially land apply, and we found it at these levels. Now what do we do? It's like, well, we probably should have thought about that before you actually tested and generated the data. So lots of issues. You know, I wish I could provide all the answers in the 45 minutes, but this has been really great.
Yes, thank you so much. And I apologize that we couldn't answer all the questions that came in. I see some really good ones. We'll try to follow up with you in writing by email. Those of you who still have one on the list, there's many. I only was able to read maybe a quarter of the questions. So, but thank you so much, Jeff. It's been a pleasure having you. And the next webinar in the series is going to be on March 24th, and will be about AFFF also, and some of the issues around it, how it was used, and some of the solutions we have now for cleaning AFFF vehicles. And for instance, how's that going to be, the clean out and the changeover to non-fluorinated foams, for instance. How are we going to do that? So thank you, everybody, for, yeah.
But I just say thank you very much. Appreciate TRS again. TRS is a member of our PFAS coalition. We learn a lot from you. I appreciate it. I'm glad there's a lot of questions. And yes, I will work with you, Gorm, to get answers to people to the questions that they've asked, because they're great questions, and we need to get back to those people. So I'll help you out with that.
Thank you so much. All right, we'll sign off now. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.